I thank the member for his remarks. The second opposition will now deliver the last speech opposing the case. Osman.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, trade is good. But when you're trading the most important natural resource that exists in the world today, it becomes a big deal. It becomes something that you have to look at, that you have to deal with carefully, and that you have to make an effective and appropriate decision. That is why we propose our counter premise, that we keep the oil here, refine it here, and use it here, because when you export it and when you deal it to other countries who refine it and then buy it back for higher prices, you are ultimately not gaining as much money as you should, you are ultimately not benefiting as much from the economy as you can, and ultimately it's not worth it. So with that being said, allow me to continue construction on the opposition case. So I'm going to bring forth a constructive argument called leaks, and I'm going to talk to you about what they said I'm going to talk to you about, except I'm going to do it better than what they predicted I'm going to talk about. Then I'm going to refute everything that the MC came up here and told you, what Grant said, and then I'm going to finally rebuild everything that David said and show you why everything he said is still relevant to this debate, is still strong, and hasn't been well refuted by Grant at all. Okay, so let's dive into construction. Let's talk about leaks. Now, one of the biggest concerns on side opposition is the danger of transferring, danger and impracticality of transferring something so valuable and so dangerous through such unstable means. Now we realize that when you transfer such huge amounts of crude oil through pipelines, mishaps and mistakes do occur. Now although mistakes are tolerable in most cases, when you have BC's marine industry and fishing industry, which composes around a quarter of BC's economy, coming intact with a company like Enbridge, who's averaging 60 spills a year, that's not something that is acceptable, Mr. Speaker. We need to realize that in the past, Enbridge has had many faulty situations where leaks have occurred and have been extremely detrimental. So let's bring up some examples. In July of 2010, Enbridge's energy pipeline leaked over 877,000 US gallons of crude oil into the Kalamazoo River. Now this was devastating for Enbridge, and many organizations around the world noticed. Now, if this isn't enough for you, as we've stated before, they average around 60 leaks a year. Now, if we do the math, that's around 5 leaks a month, and that's around a leak a week. That is completely unacceptable, and I'll take you in a second. But the big thing is that these are recorded leaks. So it's not like some insignificant amount of oil. It's a significant amount of oil that had to be recorded as a leak because it had some sort of detrimental effect. Why would you disagree?
But are these problems only going to serve for us to increase our policy, improve our record?
I understand. I understand that they're going to tell you that Enbridge has created a lot of precautionary measures to stop these kind of things from happening. But we realize that in these examples like the Kalamazoo River, why hasn't Enbridge created a policy to stop things like that? But then the next week they have another leak. It's as if Enbridge has not been using the precautionary measures that they've made, or the precautionary measures that they are making aren't effective enough to stop that kind of stuff from happening. We realize that Enbridge hasn't had this kind of consistency in coming up with effective solutions to stop these kind of oil spills. Okay, so let's continue what I was going to say before. So again, this is an extremely large number. Now, another very, very important thing is that with this bill, with the proposition of this bill, what they want to do is that they want to bring oil tankers to the coast of BC to pick up oil and go to China and give the oil there. Now, the big problem about this is that the coast of BC, the waters that are there, are known to be some of the most dangerous waters in the world. The BC coast alone has sunken 10 ships in its history. Now, when you put those two things together, you put the Enbridge history of faulty mishaps, and you put the very scary waters of BC together, you have a potential for great disaster. Now, why is that so bad for BC? Why is that especially terrible for British Columbia? Because in British Columbia, the marine industry composes a quarter of the British Columbia economy. It composes around it brings in around it gives around 20,000 jobs, and it brings in around $1.7 billion every year for the province. Why would you disagree?
What would you propose as an alternative to keep Canada's economy growing and improving?
Okay, I'll get to that in a second. I'll get to that in my refutation. I'm going to go further into analysis of my counter premise. But before I do that, let's continue on this argument. So as I've been saying, when you have something like the BC waters, when you have something like Enbridge's history, and when you have such an important and crucial element to BC's economy, you have potential for disaster. Now you put citizens at the risk of being unemployed, you put families at the risk of being underprovided, and however many jobs the pipeline and however many jobs that Ryan told you are going to be created or potentially going to be created from this pipeline are not nearly 1/10 of the jobs that this pipeline could potentially destroy. That is inevitable, that is ineffable, and you don't just destroy the marine life in BC if that occurs. You destroy the BC economy, you destroy the BC employment, and you destroy British Columbia. Okay, that's all I have to say for my constructive argument. Let's go into refutation of what the MC told you. He told you one argument and then one kind of sub-argument. So the first thing he mainly talked about was diversifying exports and how we're completely really reliant on the US, and when the US economy fails, our economy fails, we want to have exports to more nations so that when an economy fails, we can still prosper ourselves. Now what we have to say to this is two major objections. The first thing is that the pipeline is built in China's interest. They have invested most of their money in the pipeline, and whatever they save for the pipeline goes. And we realize that it's not in the best interest of Canada. They are planning to take our oil, for unrefined oil, refine it, and then sell it back to us. Now, actually not at this time. The second biggest thing we said is that, what we want to say is that we don't want to export it to all these nations. We realize that it may be good for trade, may be good for international development, and interaction, but we want to keep the oil here. We want to build more refiners and make sure that the oil is refined here and use it here, because that way we're gaining money economically. Like my partner talked about Norway. Norway does this, and they have nearly not even 1/10 of what kind of oil Canada has, and they make over $400 billion a year, when Enbridge has told you that they're going to bring $270 billion over 30 years. That is completely ridiculous. We realize that there's a more effective way of dealing with this oil. The solution that side opposition has given you today is more effective for the economy, more beneficial for the economy, and that is irrefutable. Let's go to the second thing that they talked about. They talked about how these countries, this is a contradiction that I saw in their case. They talked about how these countries like Saudi Arabia are not human rights supporters. We shouldn't buy oil from them. We should be selling oil, and we should be making the money from oil. Now, the contradiction is that they want to do trade with China. China has been notoriously known to disrespect human rights and to have many violations of human rights. So if you care about human rights and you care about dealing with countries that don't violate human rights, then why are you dealing with China? Why is China investing the most amount of money in Enbridge pipeline, and why was that in your case? We saw that as a huge contradiction. That's all I have to say about the MC's case. Let's talk about what David talked to you about. He talked about two very, very important points. The first thing is the Canadian dollar. How when the Canadian dollar rises, jobs are lost, and how we have the ability to control this right now, and we should control it because it's going to negatively affect our economy. Now, what the MC has to say to that is that jobs were lost in the recession. Not because of oil. Now, we realize that, but we realize that jobs were lost because the dollar was rising. Now, if the dollar is rising and jobs are being lost, we realize that oil is going to have that same effect on the dollar. So if oil is going to have that same effect on the dollar, those elements, those factors are still going to occur to the Canadian market, and that is inevitable, and that is something that we don't want in the Canadian economy and in the Canadian market. Now, David talked about self-sufficiency a bit, and how we shouldn't sell to foreign countries, we should keep it here, and that's mainly what I've been talking to you about in my case. And he talked about how we want self-sufficiency and how the U.S. is going to have energy security. Now, two things we want to say this is that, first, again, we should keep it here, we should refine it here. The second thing is that we don't want to help the U.S. We want to help ourselves before we help another nation. We want to ensure that nationally we are being as prosperous as we can economically, and we are doing as much as we can to ensure the success of our economy before we try to help someone else's economy. Our economy is the most important. Our nation is the most important. We should keep our oil here. We should refine it here. We should use it here. To not do that is a mistake. And because of all these reasons, we stand for absolute close.